Good evening, comrades. Welcome to the second session in our new series, ABC of Marxism, with Ian Spencer. Tonight, we're looking at what socialism is and the difference between the utopian version and the scientific version as developed by Marx. Thank you, Ian.
Evening, comrades. I'm going to recap a little bit over from last week because I appreciate that I probably rushed things a little bit. This time I'm abandoning the script in favor of just speaking. And so I want to address a few things. One of them is what we mean by socialism, but we'll develop that more later. But I also want to talk about Marx's claim to be a scientist. And this is very important because in distinguishing between socialism, utopian and scientific, Marx and Engels are making a very important point. And not only about their claim to have a completely different method compared to other socialists. Obviously, Marx and Engels didn't invent the idea of human liberation or the idea that we could have a better world. But it's very important that they did so on the basis of a scientific understanding of the nature of society and the nature of the world around us. And of course, this is a debate between Marxists and bourgeois sociologists, for example, the claim to be a science. And we see the relationship between what we might call utopian socialists and bourgeois sociology. And so I want to develop a few of those things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the French Revolution. It's not an area of my expertise, but there's some very important points. The French Revolution was hugely important and influential on Marx and Engels, partly because, as I explained last week, they grew up in that part of Germany which had been influenced by the French, most influenced by the French Revolution during the occupation. But also because many of the lessons that they subsequently drew upon their own experience of the revolutions of 1848, of the Paris Commune of 1871, they saw parallels with what had gone on in the French Revolution in 1789. And one could add to that, many of the kind of references that are made were also subsequently reappraised by Lenin in the Bolshevik Revolution. And so talks of Bonapartism and Thermidorian reaction and these kinds of terms, which were kind of commonly understood in Marx's day, continue to exert an important influence on Lenin and many other revolutionaries since. So it's worth mentioning a little bit about them. So the French Revolution, without going into any kind of great detail, we see economic crisis in France in the build-up to the French Revolution, and the inability of the monarchy to deal with the situation, the inability of the aristocracy to deal with the situation. To understand France at the time, the king required no parliament. He was an absolute monarch, as we mentioned last week, with King Charles I, asserting an absolute right to rule on the part of the monarch. There were parliaments, there were regional parliaments within France, but these, in a sense, were local government as far as France was concerned. The only notion of a parliament was the Estates General, and in which the different estates, the first estate being the clergy, the second estate being the nobility, and the third estate being what we might call the commons. This doesn't mean every common person, but it would mean peasant, everyone from sort of small property owning peasants through to the completely impoverished, but most of whom would have very little influence whatsoever. And in fact, the first two estates of the nobility and the clergy made up less than 5% of the population, but between the two of them, they could outvote the commons at any given time. So the third estate was by far and away the biggest, contributed by far and away the most to the wealth of the nation, but had the least amount of influence whatsoever. The other thing I want to raise, and I think is very important in the context of the French Revolution, and something which comes up again and again in Marx and Engels and their writings and their attitude towards politics, is the question of rights. In 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was published in France. Prior to this, of course, there had been the American Declaration of Independence. And of course, that too was rooted in the whole language of rights. And Marx and Engels had at various points quite heated fights over people on the question about rights. And even today, in looking at contemporary politics, you'll see a whole discussion around the right to work, the right to healthcare, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the things, of course, about rights is that they're supposed to be universal and apply to all. And here is the heart of the contradiction of capitalism. On the face of it, the slogans of the French Revolution of equality, liberty, and fraternity sound all well and good and suggest an equality among citizens. But of course, we know that isn't true. And that contradiction is expressed, for example, in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who talks about man is free, but everywhere in chains. So what we then have is the fundamental contradiction in capitalism, that on the one hand, it provides the basis for equality before the law as a citizen, because as a citizen, you're not a serf, you're not a slave, you own yourself. You are a property owner, even if the only property you own is your labor power. And that's just the point. The only property most citizens own is their own labor power, and they sell that to capitalists. And they don't have a choice in that matter. They still have to sell their labor power. They may well be able to choose between selling it to Nissan or Greg's the Bakers or whatever, but they still have to sell their labor power or face going hungry or face poverty in some other way or face losing their house. So the problem with rights, of course, is that on the one hand, it seems to be something progressive relative to feudalism on the grounds that you don't have a privileged position simply because you are the Duke of this or that or the other. In principle, even the nobility in Britain today is subject to the same laws. I appreciate that is somewhat of an idealized statement. Clearly, that isn't the case, but in principle, it is before the law. So the whole politics of rights then is very important and very important in the context of the French Revolution. The other point about the Great French Revolution, and I put the dates here, you can put any dates you want in if you want, but 1789 from the Estates General to when it became the National Assembly. And that's a crucial moment because instead of the Commons, the third estate, of having little or no influence, it had now a much more substantial influence in a National Assembly. Later on, as we know, one of the most important demands of the Russian revolutionaries was the convocation of a National Assembly. So it had and has a real resonance throughout radical politics. In September 1792, we have the proclamation of the First French Republic. And what we then see is changes in what's taking place on the basis of a balance of class forces. The counter-revolution in the Vendée, an area of France which was still thoroughly feudal, meant that the revolution was in danger. And this again is a theme that will crop up again and again. The revolution was in danger, so we have instead of just the National Assembly, you have the Committee of Public Safety, an idea that a smaller group of people taking charge to hold back the possibility of counter-revolution in the Vendée, but also with the danger of, as it actually took place, British intervention on the side of royalists. And then, of course, the Reign of Terror. And of course, what everybody knows about the French Revolution is that quite a few people were decapitated. It's interesting to put it into some sort of context. Most of the people who were killed in the Great Terror were people of one side or the other of revolutionaries, not just simply decapitating anybody who happened to be a nobleman or decapitating anybody who stood in the royalist side. So Robespierre, who might have been considered to be, as it were, on the left of the French Revolution, ends up being decapitated himself after the reaction of here Thermidor is part of the old French revolutionary calendar. And if anyone wants to look that up, they're all really rather beautiful names of the months. So the Reign of Terror is something which also recurs. At what point in a revolution does force have to be used in order to prevent the old ousted power, the feudal power, and potentially, therefore, it raises the question of in a capitalist, in a socialist revolution, what force would be needed to keep the former bourgeoisie in check. But here in the French Revolution, as in the English Revolution mentioned last week, it is the bourgeoisie that are coming to power. And although there were radical elements, you can hear them referred to as a sans-culotte, literally the people without trousers, or the mountain, so the people sitting in the cheap seats at the higher seats in the National Assembly, constituted a left wing and asserting radical demands for the revolution to go even further. And at the same time, you start to see a reaction against that. Sections of the bourgeoisie that realize that a revolution to go so far to get rid of feudalism is one thing, to go further again, where it possibly threatens their privileges, their exclusive rights to property and so on, from people who literally have not enough to eat and find their expression in through sans-culotte or through radicals within the Jacobin movement or beyond. And so what we then end up with is the Directory, a more conservative element that wants to, in a sense, put the brakes on the revolution. And eventually the establishment of the French consulate. And of course, Napoleon Bonaparte is the most senior consul and of course takes it to the logical conclusion, crowning himself emperor on the 18th of May, 1804. So to return to rights for a moment then, if I have a right, the idea is that it's a universal right, and so it applies to everyone, and as it were, across the board. And this is what you find right-wing people, the Daily Mail fulminates constantly about the idea, for example, that prisoners have rights. What you mean, we can't just beat them up every now and then because after all, they're in prison and they've done bad things. No, that's not the way rights work. You own yourself. You're not a serf. You're not a slave. And for that reason, you can't be ill-treated. The punishment, for example, has to be by due process. So it's not enough to get a dig in the ribs from a prison officer. The prison officer has to go through a set of procedures to say, you threw a mug of hot water over him or whatever else, and you're punished according to law. So the universality of rights is an important feature. But note that other important point, that rights on the one hand are a guarantee of liberty, that you're not going to be arbitrarily imprisoned. They're a guarantee of that you're not going to be arbitrarily killed and so on. So on the face of it, that's a good thing. But on the other hand, they're rooted in that idea that the only thing you've got to sell is your labor power. And from that point of view, one thing you have got is the right to starve. Unlike, for example, in a feudal society, in the Vendée, for example, why would poor peasants in the Vendée fight against the revolution? In part because they recognized that in ceasing to be peasants, in becoming proletarians, they would be forced from the land and were therefore free, but free to starve. And that's just the point. We're all free to starve. might have nothing else in this life, but what we have is the right to work. So rights, therefore, are important to understand as being an important advance over feudal particularism and the arbitrary rule of the nobility, but they're also the basis on which people are exploited in the context of capitalism. Rights, therefore, were quite reasonably criticized by Marx and Engels in some of their work, and we'll look at those as this series develops. For a moment, I just want to take you to here as well, because it's a famous quote, and I've divided it in half, and I'll explain why later. And because what I want to do is get back to a little thing that we sort of touched upon last week, but perhaps needed a little more expansion on. And it's this famous quote from the preface to the Contribution of Political Economy, which was published in 1859. And here I want to just draw a distinction between historical materialism and historical idealism. For the moment, though, I'll just read the quote out. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely, relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of the relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. Now, why I think this is important and why I think I've put it in here rather than later on is because if you cast your mind back to the French Revolution, and you look at the way, if ever you get to listen to something dreadful, like some jumped up bourgeois historian doing a kind of pop history event, the revolution happens because Louis XVI got out of bed one day or the wrong way, or he wasn't skilled enough at dealing with these upstarts and so on. What I was trying to get across is that science for Marx includes, for example, a science of history. That history moves in a law-like way, just in the way that tectonic plates move in a law-like way. They don't just move randomly. Atoms don't move randomly, and nor do human societies. They come into being, they exist, and they die away. They're transformed, turned into something else, sublated, and the same goes for societies. And what determines the nature of the society is the way in which the surplus is extracted from the working population. That's a crucial aspect. I mean, I'm putting it very crudely there, but it's the way in which the surplus was extracted in a feudal society is very different from a capitalist one. In a feudal society, you go and work on the lord's land, or he'll cut your bloody head off. And the relationship to direct violence and surplus extraction is transparent and obvious. By contrast, people get out of bed willingly to go to work and convince themselves they quite enjoy it really, and spend 8 hours selling their labor power, and they go home again. And they don't necessarily feel exploited because they've freely entered into a contract. But they don't have a choice not to enter into that contract. There's lots of other contracts. I mean, if you think of every interaction you take part in the course of a day as a contract, but you have a choice. I have a choice whether to do this or do something else. But in the labor contract, the only basis I've got is to sell my labor power. And so the extraction of the surplus product in feudalism is very different to capitalism. And I say this is important because I've spoken to a number of people over the years, and for whom feudalism is just immature capitalism, and other forms of society, hunter-gatherer societies, are just immature forms of capitalism, and so on. From Marx's point of view, feudalism isn't just an immature form of capitalism, it's a completely different mode of production. And what's important here is that those kind of political, economic, those sort of political, legal, structures, the nature of religion, and so on, is all entirely shaped, is in the last instance shaped by those important relations of production. In particular, the way in which the surplus is extracted from the working population. And it's that determines their consciousness. So when, for example, Thomas Hobbes talked about society needing, as it were, a state, otherwise life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Repression is then seen as an intrinsic part of a civilized society. But from Marx's point of view, the existence of the state is there because of class antagonism. It's needed to protect the exploitative relations, which are intrinsic to capitalism. And therefore, there's a few things here. Marx's criticisms of the utopian socialists is that their understanding of the world, whilst it might be laudable that they've taken the side of the poor, has remained firmly fixed to many of the ideas which are inherently related to the nature of capitalism, such as rights. And even today, to say that you have a right to something is almost the most important thing you can assert of someone. Whereas in fact, I don't have a right to food, but I definitely need it. And I think my need for food is considerably more important than any kind of right, because of course that right can be taken away, and we see rights taken away all the time. Rights, from this point of view, are at times little more than historical achievements. So moving on, just as one of the utopian socialists that was mentioned in Friedrich Engels' little pamphlet, simply called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Marx and Engels didn't write textbooks. And Engels was a very good popularizer of their joint ideas. And in 1880, Engels published Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It was a fragment, really, of a bigger book called Anti-Düring, or its full term was Eugene Düring's Revolution in Science, which was published in German in 1877. Now, Düring here, it's been referred to, regarded himself as a socialist, and he regarded himself as a scientist, but not in the way that Marx did. And Marx was taking issue with him. Not only was he not a very good socialist, but he wasn't a very good scientist either. And it was important to make that distinction. So here's Francois Noël Babeuf, who grew up in poverty and worked as a domestic servant. And he's one of the people that's mentioned by Engels in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. He represented, in a sense, a kind of proto-communist, a communist before the term was even heard of. And I mentioned last week that you saw similar currents in the English Revolution of 1640 to 1649. Gerard Winstanley, for example, who expressed his political ideas in religious terms, talking of the sin of private property. So Babeuf grew up in poverty, worked as a servant. He was a journalist, and his paper was called The Tribune of the People. And he was in favor, for example, of introducing progressive taxation. He was completely opposed to what is sometimes known as census suffrage. So the idea that if you have more property, you have more votes. If you are an educated person, you have more votes. And if that sounds strange, property qualifications still existed in the Westminster Parliament up until the 1950s. You had more, and actually in Northern Ireland, there were still property qualifications into the 1970s, where if you had a property in Londonderry and a property in Belfast, and you paid rates in both places, you had a vote in both places. So that opposed to that type of census suffrage, where your position guarantees you more votes. And Babeuf was a popular leader, so popular, in fact, they killed him. So a proto-communist in the sense of he wanted to overthrow the Directory, wanted to get back to the original revolutionary constitution, and but above all, really wanted to kind of see the consummation of bourgeois right. Babeuf, for all his radicalism, in a sense, whilst he prefigured communist movements to come, he talked, for example, about the French Revolution as the precursor to another greater revolution. And because of his attempt to overthrow the Directory in a conspiracy called the Conspiracy of the Equals, he was arrested. The other conspirators either got away with it or escaped, and Babeuf and one or two others were executed. So coming back to the Great Terror, for example, we can see that it's really between important class forces within the revolutionary movement, some representing the poorest and most radical, others representing the middle classes. Robert Owen, if anybody gets the opportunity to go to Scotland, do. And while you're there, do call into New Lanark, an utterly beautiful place to see. And this was, of course, the great culmination of Robert Owen's career as a manager, as an enlightened manager. So born in Wales, in Newtown in Montgomeryshire, left school at the tender age of 10 to become an apprentice draper. He moved to Manchester and invested in spinning mules, and if that conjures up the amusing image of horse-type animals spinning, no, it's to make thread. Instead of doing it by hand, you have an automated way of spinning thread. And he became a mill manager in Manchester using capital that he'd borrowed of £100. And eventually he married Anne Dale, a Scotswoman, in 1799, and they moved to New Lanark. Eventually became the manager of the works at New Lanark. What was extraordinary about Robert Owen was that his socialism was born out of a direct experience, not only with poverty, but also of increasingly modern production. So he had the radical idea of not working staff to death, and interestingly made a lot more profit as a direct result. And so for the early part of Robert Owen's career as a highly successful manager in Manchester and then subsequently in New Lanark, he was successful largely because he did things like this. He had free nursery schools up until the age of 3. So there was free childcare, and subsequently children were gradually introduced into the workplace rather than just simply thrown in and made to work a 10-hour day. Robert Owen radically for his time got his workers working a 10-hour day when other mills were getting them to work 13, 14 hours a day, and providing decent food. A pioneer of the cooperative movement in the sense that quite a lot of factories in those days paid people in tokens before the passing of the Truck Acts. A lot of factories paid people in tokens that they had to exchange at the company store. Robert Owen used his purchasing power and passed on the cheaper products to his workers in a way which benefited their nutritional state, and lo and behold, got better workers out of it. Now, I'm not pretending here that Robert Owen didn't tyrannize over his workers, because they had to keep their noses clean. Alcohol was strictly controlled, and if people were late, they got a bit of a warning, and so they were still expected to work within capitalist relations of production. But one of the things about him was he was widely respected by his workers, and as he got older, he got more left-wing, unlike some of us. So he was a pioneer of the cooperative movement. In 1813, he published a new view of society. He supported, for example, the introduction of the 8-hour day. He supported the Factory Act of 1819, a thoroughgoing progressive capitalist. Unlike Engels, he hadn't made that crucial step between the importance of overthrowing the entire rotten system altogether. Instead, Robert Owen's socialism would express itself in his later move to the United States and the establishment of kind of idealized communes based upon his experience of working in managing New Lanark. I mentioned him here important in his own right, but also important in the sense of being one of the people mentioned in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Also now, one of the other people that's mentioned is Henri de Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon was born into an aristocratic family. He was, in fact, a comte. He was a count, the Comte de Saint-Simon. And his particular position was his recognition of this distinction between workers as opposed to idlers. In workers, by the way, he didn't mean just horny-handed sons of toil. He meant anyone who was productive, as it were. He fought on the side of the French Revolution, the US. He fought on the side of the Americans in the US Revolution in 1776. Alongside Lafayette, he was a soldier, and supported subsequently the French Revolution from 1779 to 1809. He wasn't always a committed revolutionary. One of his early schemes was to try and to sell the metal off the roof of Notre Dame in the kind of spirit of anti-clericalism and making a buck at the same time. But nevertheless, he was arguing for really a hierarchy, but one based upon merit. And what you start to see here are the beginnings of the beginnings of bourgeois sociology, an idea that what politics is about is not the transformation of society, but the transformation from one mode of production to another, but the transformation of society, one based upon equality of opportunity, hierarchy based on merit rather than aristocratic privilege, despite the fact that he was an aristocrat, although he died in poverty, in fact. He wrote extensively on science and political economy, and one of the people he ultimately influenced was, of course, Auguste Comte, the person who coined the term sociology. So Marx's critique of utopian socialists was not just that they weren't very good socialists and they should go considerably further, but also that they were not very good scientists. And Marx was scathing of the positivism of Auguste Comte, and let's contrast the positivism of Auguste Comte with the dialectical approach of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So for Marx and Engels, in a sense, they were thoroughgoing essentialists. They recognized that science was about the discovery of the essence of a thing. Now, essentialism is a prickly term in a way because it's been appropriated, particularly by feminists, as a kind of straw man. If to say that people who call you're an essentialist if you think, for example, women should have a particular role in society because they've got the equipment to bear children. That isn't the essentialism of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The essentialism is, at one point, Marx says, if the appearance of things coincided with their essence, then all science would be superfluous. Science for Marx was about uncovering that internal essence. So, for example, as we'll see later when we look at Adam Smith on the question of money, whereas Adam Smith talks about money in rather descriptive terms as a kind of a functionalist analysis, Marx, in the early part of Marx starts off volume 1 of Capital with the commodity and then moves on to money to uncover the essence of money, what money is, and that value is therefore based on human labor and by implication the exploitation of human labor. So Saint-Simon gives rise not only to, and Marx had the greatest respect for Saint-Simon and greatest respect for him as an honest scientist, less so for his student Auguste Comte. But he was, impressed with his dedication to the lives of working people. I'm not going to dwell much on Proudhon because later on I'll talk about Marx and the anarchists in rather more detail. But Proudhon himself was better known and far more influential than Marx and Engels in his day. Those are his dates. Printer, compositor, a Freemason at a time when it wasn't just a club for the petty bourgeoisie to make contacts or whatever else, but at a time when Freemasonry was a kind of trying to turn rationality into a religion, which is why you have the set squares and compass rather than the cross. But he was the first person to regard himself as an anarchist. He met Proudhon, Marx met Proudhon while he was exiled in Paris. Again, here, what I find, what's important here to take away is that Marx's critique of Proudhon is, you can see the lineage from Henri Saint-Simon through to Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. And again, on the same basis of a moral objection to the nature of growing capitalism, a moral objection to the fact that workers are not paid the full value of the sale of their labor power. So in What is Property in 1840, famously, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and not Oppenheimer, Proudhon said, what is property? Property is theft. For Proudhon, property, wealth is the result of the systematic theft of a proportion of the surplus from the working class. What Marx was at pains to point out was that not only is Proudhon not a very good Hegelian, but he also fails to understand the nature of the essence of exploitation within the context of a capitalist society. It isn't just about workers being robbed. You can have a situation where, for example, workers have rising real wages and a rising rate of exploitation at the same time. And of course, that has a huge political impact. Later on, when Proudhon wrote The Philosophy of Poverty, Marx parodied it by publishing a critique called The Poverty of Philosophy. Proudhon, drawing upon Saint-Simon, argued for mutualism, workers' associations, cooperatives. Proudhon himself was a member of the French Parliament. But crucially, he was opposed to the idea of violent revolution, the complete transformation of society. And what you see in Proudhon is almost a suggestion that we return to a state of simple commodity production. And again, if that sounds familiar, think of the Green Party. Think of all sorts of organizations who said, well, what we need to do is to go back and make nice tables on a craft basis or something like that, or live in communes in the style of Robert Owen. The point for Marx was, of course, none of this will do. In what we need first and foremost is abundance, and we need to understand the very nature of society. Anyone who had the great good fortune to remember the late Margaret Thatcher will know that she was very fond of quoting Adam Smith. She was quite fond of the Adam Smith Institute as a right-wing think tank. And of course, what everybody knows about Adam Smith is he was a person who passionately argued for free trade and the importance of unfettered capitalism. Or is that it? You see, Marx had the greatest respect for Adam Smith as an honest inquirer. Smith, in a sense, didn't pull his punches. And I just want to suggest that if anyone fancies a bit of reading, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations is not a bad place to start. It's a beautifully written, crafted book. And it's very, very readable, an absolute joy. So Smith studied philosophy in Glasgow and Oxford. There is a Adam Smith building at Glasgow University where I studied. And what Smith is chiefly remembered for is a number of very important things. Firstly, his discussion of the division of labor, where he talks about the way in which the production of pins in a pin factory using the division of labor is greatly increased. He's also famous for talking about the paradox between water and diamonds. Why is it that something like water, which is essential for life, has so little value when diamonds, by contrast, which is hardly used for anything apart from decoration, are so valuable? And of course, the answer he comes up with is the amount of labor embodied in securing those things. But we live in a wet country. You can get water. I mean, you can get water falling from the sky, and you just have to collect it, and you won't go short. And by contrast, diamonds take a great deal to win from the earth, and then to work into something which is beautiful. So he has a labor theory of value. That's interesting, because Marx has a labor theory of value. And what's important about the labor theory of value is that it has human exploitation at its very heart. Although Smith, when he talks about it, is a bit mealy-mouthed. He talks about the worker sharing his product with the owner of the factory or whatever. But nevertheless, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that what Adam Smith is saying is it's the amount of labor embodied in the product that determines its value, and not, for example, utility, which he dismissed completely in the Water and Diamonds paradox. So he has a labor theory of value. He's very famous for being talking about the hidden hand, the way in which capitalism manages to distribute things in a way as if there is a kind of hidden hand distributing resources and rewards throughout society, almost in a kind of godlike way. Money, I've already mentioned. Money, really, Smith is talking about money as, well, you can't get half a goat if you're going to exchange it for a sheep or something. So really, Smith talks about money in functionalist terms. Money is something which is there because it's useful. What Marx understood is that money is a universal equivalent which embodies human labor, and embodies value. And as it embodies value, it is also an expression of a social relationship between the exploiter and exploited. Why talk about political economy at all? Marx doesn't talk about economics; he talks about political economy. Political economy is, if you like, the philosophy of economics. It asks the most fundamental questions. It asks, what do we mean when we say something has value? What determines that value and the proportions? Which are the productive parts of the economy and which are not so productive? And of course, this was later developed at greater length by David Ricardo, an interesting person in his own right, born in London as the son of a stockbroker of a sort of Portuguese Sephardic Jewish heritage, and the Sephardic Jews from Spain, Portugal, North Africa were among the first to be allowed back into Britain after they were all murdered in 1290, allowed back during Cromwell's period as Lord Protector. He was the Whig MP for Portarlington in Ireland. It was a seat that he bought. You could do that in those days. This was one of those rotten boroughs. But he was a liberal, and he was in favour of free trade. He opposed the Corn Laws, and he was opposed to slavery. Crucially, he wrote the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, and it's a considerably significant step ahead of Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's a sod to read, I have to say. Smith was a wonderful writer. Ricardo wasn't. The other reason why I mentioned him is the dismissive comment by Samuelson that really Karl Marx is nothing more than a minor post-Ricardian. And it fails to meet, and it just shows that Samuelson fails to understand what Marx was trying to do. Marx was not, when he wrote Capital, trying to write a book about economics. He was trying to write a book, he did write a book, which was critical of many of the presuppositions that Smith and Ricardo and Mill and Thomas Malthus put forward, but clearly failed to understand even in their own terms. And that's the basis of his critique. And that's why Marx was the scientist that was superior, as it were, to Smith and Ricardo and Proudhon and all the others. Then the other part of the quote that I'll leave you with is, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this is merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, which is the property relations with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. So in France, as in Britain, the development of capitalism within the womb, as it were, of feudal society becomes the basis for a new society. Then begins the era of social revolution. The changes in the economic lead, sooner or later, to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. Thank you, comrades. I look forward to our discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, comrade. That was really good. Again, I think you succeeded very well at drawing different bits together that are usually set apart, you know, the biography of them, of Marx and Engels, the political economy, as well as, you know, their political writing, so, and their philosophical writing. So thank you very much for doing that. Comrades, if you have questions or contributions, please click raise hand or put your question in the Q&A and I can read it out. As always, there's no question that's stupid or, you know, boring or whatever. If you have something you'd like to say, please do so. To get the ball rolling, then that last quote is of course hugely important. How does society change, isn't it? And that's where they made such a huge contribution and, well, revolutionized thinking about how things change in society. And perhaps we could talk about this a little bit more, you know, that it is in fact not natural. You know, these things don't just develop. You mentioned that earlier. You had, you know, some people tell you that society was always going towards capitalism. You know, a lot of people believe that today we are the climax of humanity. You know, it can't get any better than that. Yes, there are little problems here and there, but capitalism is the sort of the zenith of, you know, the climax of human development, and we've always gone that way, etc. But Marx and Engels point out very with huge understanding that that wasn't the case at all. Things could have gone all sorts of different ways all throughout history. And perhaps you could expand on that a little bit, you know, that the forces of production, as you say, you know, come into conflict with the modes of production and the developments there. And suddenly what used to be useful, you know, which was useful for the social system, now becomes a fetter and needs to be swept away with. That a lot of people did not see it like that before Marx and Engels did that. They revolutionized thinking on how society changes.
I think that it's almost, I mean, you could start anywhere you wanted with Hegel. One suggestion is possibly to start with the philosophy of history. It is that the idea that first of all, there is a law-like movement in history. Now, there's a law-like movement in all sorts of things. And arguably, the point is that there isn't a division between social science in Marx and Engels and natural sciences. And that's why later on, for example, Engels was keen to investigate natural sciences, and he published, well, it wasn't published in his lifetime, but Dialectics of Nature. And they took an interest in anthropology, and they took an interest in natural sciences and mathematics and a whole range of things. So there is a law-like movement in the development of societies. It isn't purely random. If you have to sit and listen to god-awful Simon Sharma or one of these types who are talking about history, you'd think it was just about individuals who got out of bed on the wrong side of the bed on a particular day, or did this on a particular day. Or if only King Charles I had, you know, been a bit more reasonable, he could have kept his head and we could have had a smooth transition to capitalism. Well, no. The point is that an absolute monarchy, I mean, the monarchy of the early feudal period wasn't absolute. You know, they were the sort of first among equals, as it were. But the power was diffuse. You know, barons owning a particular piece of land were the absolute lords in their particular piece of land. They might have paid fealty to the king and had to, you know, give military service and that kind of thing. But the development of absolute monarchy was something which was a feature of the decline of feudalism. And this is another feature. You can find examples of the decline of feudalism fairly early on. The Crusades were an interesting case in point. You wanted to secure the trade routes, particularly in the Levant, and therefore the Crusades are launched not just because we need to get back Jesus's birthplace, but because actually we want to secure the trade routes and to make money out of it. And while we're at it, all the Jews get slaughtered and robbed of their money. And that's a feature of the decline of feudalism. What do we see in the decline of capitalism? And in a sense, the fact that the bourgeoisie were a revolutionary class that came into being by overthrowing the feudal aristocracy, it points to the future for the possibility of socialism. Arguably, features that are socialistic, whether it's the joint stock company, something which is collectively owned rather than the individual property of an individual capitalist, is one of those kind of socializing factors. The fact that huge numbers of capitalist enterprises are actually owned by pension funds and other forms of collective ownership point towards the development of collective forms of ownership that will ultimately be the supersession of capitalism. But there has to be a political agency as well. And of course, that political agency can be stopped. It can be repressed. Workers' representatives can be killed, bought off. People don't believe them because they've been told they're anti-Semitic or some crazy nonsense. So there's a whole range of factors. And of course, the world could come to an end. We could end up in a nuclear cataclysm, or we could just simply face a worsening world by climate change. There is no, it is not absolutely, there has to be a very real change, a very real revolution. It's not going to happen automatically, spontaneously. But what will happen is the decline of capitalism. We can guarantee that. We just don't know.
It's happening, isn't it?
Yes. And it throws up strange forms. And, what the hell is China, for example? It never was socialist, but what is it now? Is it capitalist? Pretty much, but in a very peculiar form, with a strong centralized state and so on, and a big state sector. On the other hand, I mean, China isn't alone. The success of the COVID vaccine was in large part because of central government direction. Here's money for the universities, here's money for companies, go and make the bloody thing and do it quickly, and so on.
You also, just one question before I bring people on from the floor. The idea that the state is a neutral body, that sort of is above us. I mean, that's still quite a widespread idea, that my daughter will tell me, the police is there to help us when there's, when somebody's breaking into your house. Obviously, yeah, she's not had the experience of a miners' strike or something, but that idea that, that the state is just there, it just hovers and it's there to good for the good of all people and everybody can appeal to it. I mean, we kind of know this, but the idea as well that the productive forces form the base on which everything logically is built upon. The forces of production that are now in capitalism lead to structures that capitalism requires for it to be reproduced, and it also influences the productive forces itself. So it's a round it's a round thing. But that was quite revolutionary as well, wasn't it?
And of course, there is something of a contradiction in the state. We do see situations where, for example, you have the National Health Service, and the National Health Service is got nothing to do with socialism. It came into being as a kind of nationalization and rationalization of the poor law infirmaries and charitable institutions and county asylums and all these other things. but it came into being at a particular time for a particular reason. Firstly, the hodgepodge of provision that preceded it wasn't working, and it couldn't cope with world wars. But also, it wasn't working in the sense of it was complicated, difficult to administer, and also you needed to be able to ensure the relative compliance of the working class. They'd just been through wars, and the idea that you been through a war, you fought against fascism, and then all of a sudden you're going to go back on the dole again, and your children are going to die because you can't afford to go to the doctors. So concessions are made, and concessions have been made. Bismarck, no socialist, he famously makes the concession to the German working class in recognition of their radicalism. And if he doesn't make concessions, the German Social Democrats will get stronger and stronger. And so Germany has a system of national insurance before Britain because of Bismarck. The state acts in the interest of the ruling class and can be the more kind of thoughtful end of the interest of the ruling class at times. Other times, of course, it's brutal repression. And whether they need to make concessions or beat you to death is dependent upon the circumstances of the time.
Thank you, Ian. Malcolm, you're next.
Hi. Hello, Tina. How are you? You all right? And Ian, good stuff. I haven't seen you for a long time. I used to see you a lot in the olden times when you used to be on not the Andrew Marr show in the olden times, but I haven't seen you a lot since. But yeah, hello again. Yeah. So part of the French Revolution was caused by the French bankrupting themselves, trying to fund the American Revolution, and that they bankrupted themselves, and that gave rise to the French Revolution. 10-20 years after 10-15 years after the American War of Independence. I've just been speaking to somebody else who follows revolutionary socialist ideas, and they said, "Oh well, the French Revolution ended in tears," and I suppose many might argue that the French one and the American one and the Russian one also ended in tears. And I quoted the fact that the American Revolution involved life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for white men of Protestant stock. So would he regard those three revolutions, the French, the American, and the Russian, as successes or failures, and reasons why?
It's too early to tell.
So said the Chinese man, didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, the relationship between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, you're absolutely right. France wanting to make sure that Britain lost its colonies in America supported the American colonists, and understandably so, and that's why there's a Statue of Liberty and all the rest of it. And of course, you're also right about the Declaration of the Rights of Man. I mean, it was the rights of man. It wasn't the rights of women, and it certainly wasn't the rights of black men. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born and created free and equal. It's a famous opening line of the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's a part of natural reason that all men are born and created free and equal, except all the slaves. And actually, most of the early US presidents were slave owners. And Thomas Jefferson was a famous slave owner. George Washington was a slave owner, and so on. And there's no contradiction in that. because of course, even to be a citizen is something which hasn't happened overnight. Even in whatever revolution, citizenship, in a sense, has had to be. In the context of France, again, the contradiction was there. San Domingo, Haiti, was the most prosperous colony, the slave colony that France had. The loss of that colony was catastrophic for the French economy. But Toussaint Louverture was an intelligent man, and he understood the declarations of the rights of men apply to black men too. Which is why they carted him off to Paris and he died in chains. By contrast, Dessalines was far more ruthless and eventually drove the French and defeated the British Army as well. The fact that the English Revolution of the 1640s, the French Revolution, the American Revolution successfully brought into being capitalism is self-evident. You know, they succeeded in bringing in capitalism. They succeeded in bringing the bourgeoisie to power. So the Russian Revolution is a bit more of a moot point, isn't it? What you have, I would argue, is a genuine attempt to move things on a bit. You know, no one expected the revolution to break out in Russia. It was firmly expected that it would be in Germany, which was the most advanced communist party in the world. But we know what happened. And the consequences of that was, of course, that the Russian Revolution was defeated. And I would regard it as having been defeated by 1921, 22, when you start to see the suppression of factions. We won't go into that here, but it was a genuine attempt, but it was beaten. And revolutions that are beaten will revert to an earlier system. So it's again, but instead of being able to revert to full liberal democracy, what you have is a deformed monster, which is you know, like no capitalism that Marx and Engels would have recognized.
Thank you. Julian asked a good question in the chat, and perhaps you could expand it a bit on the role of the working class.
Well, yes, my original question arose from your comment about bourgeois society emerging from the womb of feudalism over, I would add, many centuries. So the question was, where is the socialist fetus in the womb of capitalism? And of course, the short answer is the working class. But the working class are not organized around production, a socialist form of production. They're organized within bourgeois establishments, etc. Do I need to say more, or is it clear?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a perfect answer for you. I would point to, I suppose, and it raises an interest. It raises as many questions as it answers. Is that the proletariat has been growing steadily, and when Marx and Engels were writing, they were writing at a time when the proletariat might have been the most powerful class politically, the most important from the point of view of future prospects. But there was a huge petit bourgeoisie, there was a huge peasantry, and these different class forces were, of course, discussed at length with in the revolutions of 1848, and again in the Paris Commune. Yeah, interestingly, Marx and Engels obviously both thought that that socialism was at least possible in their lifetime. Now, either they were wrong or they were right, but now what I find interesting is that there are now more proletarians than there've ever been. What I find now is that production was internationalized in Marx's day. I mean, even things like world trade was well developed in the 14th century, which is why the Black Death wiped out a third of Europe, because the world trade brought the rats that brought the fleas and so on. So you have these forms developing along the way. But as I say, the proletariat has never been bigger. Large parts of the world, in China, for example, whatever one thinks of the Chinese Communist Party, or whereas the early attempts in the 1920s to bring about socialism in China resulted effectively in deindustrialization, and therefore Mao having to go to the peasantry. You now have a Chinese proletariat, which is just that. It is a proletariat. They're not based on the peasantry now. The majority of Chinese workers are completely dependent upon industrial production. And the internationalization is a feature of, you can't buy anything that isn't made in several different countries throughout the world. And the fact that we can see in real time what's happening in Beijing, in Palestine, in wherever, creates the possibility of a world movement and of a world socialism. I would argue. I mean, people are free to fight me back on that one. Or anything else.
I mean, it is just over 100 years ago, isn't it, then, that where the working class was actually organized on a much higher level. Though it was smaller numerically, it was much better organized politically, and tried to overthrow, and almost did it. I mean, it is something I think we should revisit and keep in our heads, that had the German working class succeeded in making a revolution, just as the Russians did, we could be in an entirely different situation today. The world could be an entirely different place. There were various reasons why there wasn't a communist party in place, and there was a sort of perhaps a lack of leadership in Germany. And the question is, was there enough abundance at that time? In Russia, for sure, there wasn't. In Russia, socialism was, because it was also not international, etc. Had Germany and other countries in Europe followed, we would have been in a different situation entirely. But yeah, numerically, we're in a stronger position today. It's just we're not organized very well. And I think our series is one of the many efforts people are making to try and increase those levels of organization, because that is, we're there objectively but not subjectively. The working class is not ready, unfortunately.
And defeat has its consequences. Marx, when the workers of Paris and the National Guard took power, Marx's attitude was don't do it. He knew they would get beaten, but once they'd done it, he said, "Well, don't just sit there. March on Versailles." Because Engels was a military expert. He knew if they just sat there in Paris, they'd be wiped out, and they were right. And not only that, but it put the workers' movement back at that, many decades. We have to say that the defeat of the Russian Revolution has also had its consequences, and Stalinism and social democracy have exerted their own influence, and we're still living with it. Just as an explosion in light years away still has its reverberations that can be detected on Earth, we still are living with the reverberations of the defeat of the Russian Revolution.
Yep.
There was a moment. Just a brief comment. There was a moment when you quoted Marx, that it's the social conditions that determine consciousness and not consciousness that determine social conditions. And I've always been a little bit, I suppose, tainted by idealism in that regard, because I think everything that you said about a socialist revolution is that it's a matter of conscious political action. We won't have the change in social conditions within the womb of capitalism, and unless I would nominate things like community action groups, to some extent, some trade union activity when they start to take control of the means of production with occupations and so on. But on the whole, not. It's all reformist.
I'm not disagreeing with you. What I would point out, I suppose, is that revolutions and transformation from one mode of production to another isn't usually a moment. After the defeat of the revolutions of 1848, given that Engels had fought on the barricades and could have lost his life very easily, the first thing he did was sit down and write The Peasant War in Germany, because he could see the resonance of the peasant war in Germany at the time of the Protestant Reformation as class struggle, and many of the social forces that were taking place at the time were also repeated in the revolutions of 1848. A middle class putting itself forward, and one class wanting the revolution to be pushed forward, but being immature in a sense, of not being developed enough. And we see that, for example, with Babeuf. You have a proto-communist revolutionary, but without really a proletariat to act upon. Or there is a proletariat, but it's not very big, and it's mostly in Paris. And similarly, I mean, although we think of the bourgeois revolution of the 1640s in England, there had been peasant revolts before, and different kind of uprisings of one sort or another that were crushed, but still expressed idealistic notions, usually in religious terms. And similarly, the transition from the ancient world, the Roman Empire, for example, to feudalism, was hundreds of years, and lots of different upheavals along the way. What seems to me strange and interesting is just how fast things move when they move. I joined the Young Communist League in 1974, when the Soviet Union was going ever onwards and upwards, and was going to catch up with the West, and nobody in their right mind was actually saying, well, actually it's unstable and inefficient and generally hopeless, and by the way, it's not even socialist. But some were, the Journal Critique, for example, and others.
Thanks. Cheryl, please.
Hi, Ian. Thank you so much for the presentation. I felt like I was back in the class on my university.
I hope that's a good thing.
On my university degree course, but I don't retain all the knowledge in my head, unfortunately. It seems to, yeah. I met you on the Palestinian demonstration.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah. He didn't recognize me because in the real world, I'm different from the on the screen world. What I was going to say, a couple of things. Am I right that this text that you're referring to is the early works of Marx? And was that not, the text, the Critique of Political Economy? And also, did he not formulate his ideas quite significantly in relation to Hegel?
Mm.
I just wondered why you hadn't included that. I mean, not to say you can include everything. I thought that he was very influenced in that piece of work by his criticism of Hegel and how Hegel interpreted the world through the mind, it was changed through ideas, and he had more. His criticism was that things change looking at the materially as well, because isn't that why he has that statement on his tombstone? The world has philosophers have interpreted the world in many. I don't know if that is actually in any of his works, but philosophers have interpreted the world in many ways. The point is to change it.
Yeah, it's in the theses on Feuerbach.
Oh, is it? Okay.
You often find it as an appendix to Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy by by Friedrich Engels. It's usually tucked all the way at the back of that, or in the collected works. It's the thesis on Feuerbach.
He was kind of, yeah, sorry, anyway, I'll let you. Oh, the other thing I was just going to mention in relation to the difference between water and diamonds, that water now is a very expensive commodity, isn't it? There's lots of profit to be made. I was just saw an article the other day about the profit made from water and how the director of Thames Water is getting a pay rise of, I don't know, a significant amount of money. I was just popped in my head how water has now become quite a political issue and is, has been certainly in this country, commodified because of privatization. Thank you so much.
Well, I mean, I think what we are experiencing, I would suggest, is a period in which relations of production are becoming more transparent. When the water was sold off for whatever nominal fee, we were being told that there was going to be huge amounts of investment coming in from private capital, whereas in fact what they've been doing is leeching every penny they can get out of it and investing as little as possible. And now it's becoming blindingly obvious. Water, in a sense, is always a commodity, particularly if you don't live in a very wet country like this one. But you're right about Hegel. I think what I was trying to get across really was Hegel is absolutely indispensable to Marx. And the reason why I say that is, of course, other writers have tended to regard the dialectics as a bit of a dead dog, that somehow we don't need wet mystical stuff. The importance of Marx standing Hegel on his feet is to point out that it's not the idea, the absolute idea, that is the motor in history, but class struggle is the motor in history. So, Hegel had his radical period, and that was expressed, well, I mentioned it last week with talking about Hegel referring to Napoleon as that world spirit astride a horse, dominating the world. I think without an understanding of Hegel, Marx would not have been able to develop the ideas that he did. The contribution to the critique of political economy was published in 1859, and it was almost a kind of first draft of Capital, as it were. It's still worth a read, even though there are bits of it that are quite different to Capital. So in contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx doesn't draw the distinction between labour and labour power. It sounds a bit arcane, but what Marx is arguing is that what the worker sells is his capacity to labour. You sell your capacity to labour. You don't sell your labour as such. And let me draw this analogy. If I go and buy a car, I buy a car, which is potential transport. I buy a car that, when it's used, then yields transport. When the capitalist buys my labour power, they buy that commodity, and once that's put to work, that yields labour. And the importance of that was to this distinction between profits come from everybody just being robbed. Marx saying, no, there is a scientific process by which we can understand this. The worker sells their labour power, but labour power, unlike all other commodities, yields more value than it costs to buy it. And that's therefore the origin of profits. We'll come on to this more in a later session. But that's the important thing, that firstly, it's an objective relationship. So I might get very well paid and I might enjoy my job. That doesn't stop me being exploited. In fact, some jobs you can be even more exploited, and it's and you get very well paid, and you're even more exploited than somebody who's working in a sweatshop in East London. So yes, that's crucial. And even further than that, I mean, when Marx was actually writing Volume 1 of Capital, there's a famous letter where he writes to Engels, and he says that when he was sitting down to write Volume 1, he found it very, very useful to go back and reread Hegel's Science of Logic. So without the knowledge of Hegel, Marx would not have been a Marxist.
Interesting. Mark, please.
Yeah. Firstly, it was a great talk. Well done. I learned a lot, to be fair. Profit, just the last bit. As we know, if you're working in a private company, all workers, in essence, want their company to be profitable. Otherwise, they don't have a job, and they want them to be more profitable so they can earn more money. Those are just the basic facts of working anywhere. To be fair, obviously, you have to be organised to get some of that profits, but that is what's required. So workers will talk to bosses how waste can be removed from the processes and practices. So it's an essential part. It's in everybody's mind. That profit is essential. It can't be ignored, and that's the basis of going to work. Those in the public sector can have a very different attitude towards that, and of course that can make it very difficult in bringing workers from the public and private sector so they can both recognise their common interest, which is ultimately have a system where we don't need profit and we have a system where people, when they need something, can get it. What I've always found interesting is by socialists in this country, or people who declare themselves as socialists, one of the common arguments you'll hear, particularly at election time, is they'll say things like, well, we're the sixth richest country in the world, so therefore what should happen is we should have a better national health service, we should have a better public sector. What that actually means is they've forgotten why we might be the sixth richest country in the world, which is the super exploitation of workers, particularly black workers overseas, both in the current period and in the historical past. So my question is quite straightforward, is how important do you feel that the issue of nationalism is in confusing the working classes? I use the term classes in terms of the fact that there are different sections of the working class. Anyway, that's my question. Cheers for that.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, it's hard to underestimate, isn't it? Nationalism and crucially imperialism, which is the point you're making. If you ask the question, why did Britain never throw up a mass Marxist party? I mean, what we had was the Labour Party, which in a sense has always been a capitalist workers' party, a workers' party, but one which accepts the premise of capitalist exploitation. And where we have had Marxist parties, they've been small and subsumed within that. It can't be unconnected to an empire that was, 1/4 of the land surface of the world and dominated all the major seas, where the Royal Navy was at any given time at least the size of the next two biggest navies, where the extraction of the surplus from around the world was built. 5 minutes walking through the British Museum or 5 minutes walking through the streets of London or whatever will show you that, and not just Britain either. I mean, Belgium was fascinating in the brutality of the extraction of a surplus by King Leopold, and so many other countries besides. And nationalism, of course, led to the catastrophe of World War I, with fighting our brothers and sisters in Germany rather than their own ruling class. And communists have tried to grapple with this one way or another. And of course, famously, Lenin talking about the right of nations to self-determination. There's a whole debate around that. I mean, my feeling is that in the context of empires at the time, it is understandable that Lenin should take that position of supporting, for example, national movements to break up empires, not least of which because those parts of, for example, the British Empire. I mean, there's no doubt about it that Britain impeded the development of India with catastrophic results, both in terms of the impoverishment of the Indian population and up to and including millions dying of starvation in the Bengal famine or whatever else. So it is understandable that he would support. And we know, for example, that Engels was deeply concerned with the subjugation of Ireland. His partner, his wife, Mary Burns, was of course Irish, and Marx and Engels were absolutely committed to the idea of Irish independence. What attitude we take towards nationalist movements today is a different question, and I think it depends on the circumstances. There are circumstances under which we say, well, a nationalist movement might have a progressive, and that tends to be the way in which it's phrased, can have a progressive tendency. So we can think about the relatively progressive attitude of Gamal Nasser in Egypt, but how do we then appraise that alongside Islamist nationalism? I think they're quite different, and they need to be understood in their historical context and at the time. But broadly speaking, as a communist, I'm in favour of the end of all nation states, and it's as true today as when Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto: "A worker has no country. My country is the international proletariat." And if somebody then turns around and say, "Well, all these people are coming over here taking our jobs and our houses," that's bloody nonsense. What we have to argue for is a world society where we're not, for example, laying waste to great sections of the world, causing huge waves of migration. There should be a kind of plan to rebuild the world. And that would have to be the consequence of socialism.
Also a shame that some of the left leaders are so keen on nationalism, for example, George Galloway or Sarah Wagenknecht, end up defending, our capitalism, the British capitalism, or maybe the Scottish or English, as opposed to the rest. And that is really a death for the left. John, please.
Thank you.
Oh, me. All right.
Sorry, you, John.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just looking for what one of my questions was. I asked two. First one is about the Russian and French revolutions, and you went through, Ian, the different phases of the French Revolution, from the National Assembly, which gave the sans-culottes a lot more power than they'd had in the Estates General, and then the Reign of Terror, followed by the Thermidor and the Directory. And I wondered, do you see a similar or dissimilar process to that in the Russian Revolution? And because I think there perhaps are some, if not all, of those stages, all over a different kind of period of time. The second question is about base and superstructure. In the many Marxists that I've read and known have actually questioned the idea, and I don't know whether Marx and Engels actually put it so definitely, whether there is a feedback from the superstructure to the base. A couple of examples, for instance, Silicon Valley producing ideas about computerization, that feeds back into the personal computer. The personal computer plus lockdown enables people to work from home in a mass way, which hadn't been done before. That changes the relations of production, the relations that a lot of workers have to production. Secondly, and again, Silicon Valley produces AI, artificial intelligence, and that threatens to really change the material way in which capitalism produces a surplus. So two questions there.
Yeah, well, first of all, those kind of parallels with the idea of a Thermidorian reaction were, of course, applied to the Russian Revolution. More as a metaphor, I would argue, than an expression of possibly class interest, but that's something that is open to debate. And so, you know, it's hard to avoid the parallel between the Bonapartism of you know, the rise of Napoleon as someone who effectively put a stop to the revolution, partly in his own interests and expressing the interests of a particular part of the French ruling class, and what was going on with Stalin. Once you've got the revolution defeated and isolated, where does it go? Where does it, you know, there is an argument, so, well, at what point should they have just sort of said, oh, well, back to Geneva then and go into exile and whatever? And was that even a possibility? Because presumably then most good militants would just be slaughtered. Or do you just have to do what they did, which was try and keep the powder dry and do what they could? And so we see, for example, by 1921, I think, you know, Lenin enters into the Treaty of Rapallo, and so is trading with Germany because Russia needs German manufactured goods urgently, and is prepared to trade with the people who killed Liebknecht and Luxembourg. So, so at what point do you? And is that a different process? What you have in Russia, in a sense, is it's not socialism, but it's not capitalism either. And it becomes a historically specific form of production, but one which has no mature form and can only degenerate. And Trotsky recognized that, but arguably not fully. And in a sense, how would he? He wasn't there, because he was, you know, by 1929 he was out of the picture altogether, and therefore it was very difficult for him to maintain that position. On the question of base and superstructure, I mean, one of the biggest problems we face is the idea, again, it becomes a kind of caricature, a straw man, really. The base shapes the superstructure, and it couldn't possibly be the other way around. But of course, we know it does. That ideas, as someone else has said, the ideas have to change as well. And so if we take an example, capitalism brings Protestantism into being. That's a materialist kind of interpretation. So Protestantism comes into being as an ideal religious expression of capitalist relations of production. But at the same time, of course, radical ideas can be expressed in religious forms, which can have a real effect upon working people. And ideas, once they take hold of the masses, themselves become a material force, a material factor. The point about base and superstructures is that they are, in a sense, interpenetrating opposites. And it's not just dialectics as the last refuge of a scoundrel. The fact is that they do influence one another, and sometimes more and sometimes less at different times. And it will depend upon the balance of forces at any given time. Silicon Valley's interesting, and maybe in that context it's particularly interesting. What you're having presumably in Silicon Valley is a development of a highly expert group of workers who have a privileged position, but whose privileged position is somewhat dependent on the development, ironically, of the very technology that they're developing themselves. And so people lose their position and become reduced in society and so on. And earlier forms of that would be compositors. Compositors tended to be among the most skilled and among the most radical workers because they were illiterate. But compositors eventually lost their position completely because you only need to be able to work a keyboard, and you can set type and operate, and skills change over time, and class forces change over time. And so therefore this relationship between base and superstructure is incredibly fluid.
Yeah.
And the idea that they're not separate, it's almost like saying, what's the relationships between the nucleus and the electrons in an atom? Yes, they can be separated, but they have an integral relationship to one another.
Marx and Engels' point was always that it's, as I understand it, that it's, it's not enough to just say we have to try hard to make a better society, and it's just we have to really wish for it. It's like wishful thinking. But what you have to do, you have to change it is the forces of production that need to be changed. You need a revolution rather than say, if the rich people are a bit nicer or share their wealth a bit more. It's that whole idea, isn't it? Sort of, we just share it out more. No, we have to do away with it all if you really want to change society and how things work. Steve, please.
Are you mute?
I couldn't manage to unmute myself, but there we have managed it eventually. I've got a couple of points really to make or add. I hope to John, to Ian, to a very good presentation that you made, very interesting presentation. I wanted to just go back to the idea that we can really understand Marx and I've said this, I will say it again, but I'll come back to that Marx was a Republican communist, not an anarcho-communist. They're two quite different things. And so Marx is always making a critique of the anarchists, and that's, and as you rightly identified Proudhon as a sort of one of the early anarchists in this sense, so Marx is coming straight into conflict with Proudhon. And you rightly go back to Hegel and to the French Revolution, which is the big factor in Marx's development and in Hegel's development, of course, because it's the French Revolution that gives Hegel his whole point that you made about laws of historical development, his whole thesis. And hence the Republic of 1792 and the Constituent Assembly, all of which come round again, as John's just said, in 1917 as well. So it doesn't just end there. But the point about Hegel was he was a constitutional monarchist. He thought that a constitutional monarchy was the most perfect form of state. That was the conclusion that he drew from the French Revolution. He must have been thinking of Britain, I guess. But the young Hegelians critique that. They developed a Republican critique of Hegel that Marx was involved in developing. And then because what they were talking about was freedom. And so that the whole thing about the French Revolution was all about freedom. And then Marx went on from that and began to criticize these Republicans by thinking that freedom couldn't be secured just by a political republic. And he began to look in 1843, 1844. He started looking at the Silesian weavers and the wood gatherers and things like this. He started going into economics. So in a way, he was going from superstructure in your model, Ian, I guess, to base. You're starting to get towards the base and realizing that unless you dealt with a question of property, then there wouldn't be freedom. And so you can see that's the beginning of a communist idea. So he's looking at Owen as well, as also very important in all of this, Robert Owen, as you say quite rightly. And then of course you go into the Communist Manifesto, but he didn't actually drop his republicanism. He kind of reinvented it later. But at that point, communism, his communistic ideas are replacing his Republican one. But the common theme between them is about how you get freedom. And that's a really important thing. And you can't get freedom if you've got property ownership. If certain classes of people are owning property. I mean, I'm not, well, this is not a disagreement, I'm sure. But anyway, as I saw the title, I was thinking about, I went back and dug out a book as it was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. So I went back to Engels's piece in 1880 called that name, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and that's post-capital. But there's a very interesting passage in there for me, because in that he talks about the socialization of capitalism. And he begins to talk about the idea that he says, in this, all the social functions for the capitalists are now performed by salaried employees. It's like a manager. He's noticing this managerial capitalism coming on the scene. And the owners are now merely almost just collecting their dividends. They don't have the function anymore. They all go sit there getting their share dividends and collecting the money. But the actual management stuff is now being done by, so that's quite interesting into a modern form of capitalism. And later on, he goes on that this process of the accumulation and concentration of capital leads to the transformation, he says, of capital into joint stock companies and trusts, and into state ownership, which doesn't do away with the capitalist nature of the productive forces. Now, this is an important point, because state ownership, state capital, is still the employment of wage labor. So when you have the state employing people in wage contracts, it's state capital. Now, all it is the most socialized form of capitalism, because it doesn't appear to be capitalism anymore, because nobody appears to own it, because the state owns it, as opposed to the private capitalism. So it's almost as if ownership has disappeared, but it hasn't really, because the labor force is still alienated from the means of production in a state enterprise. Ian, as I know you know, we all worked in state enterprises anyway, out there, so we understand all that. And he goes on to say, the modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalist, the ideal personification of total national capital. That's if all the capital was owned by the state, we'd have not socialism, we'd have the idealized form of socialized capitalism. Clearly getting towards socialism, by the way, but it's that capitalism gets us towards socialism by its own development. We're on the road to socialism by the evolution of capitalism. But of course, the only people that can change it, of course, is the proletariat, which comes back to that. That's the only people, the only class that can actually take that other next step, you know, as we saw in the Russian Revolution. So that was my 2 points. One was about his Republican aspect of freedom, that he comes from Hegel, it's very important, and then about the socialization of capitalism, which is going on as we speak.
Thanks, Steve. Ian, that was the last contribution from the floor. So if you would like to use your last 10 minutes as well to sum up perhaps the discussion. Very interesting.
Steve, you're absolutely right. I mean, at the heart of Marx, and the most important aspect really, is freedom and democracy. Now, there's democracy and there's democracy. So bourgeois liberal democracy is nothing like the democracy that was understood by Marx. However, Marx and Engels struggled consistently against feudal autocracy and certainly supported every move towards the development of the republic. Now, here we're talking, of course, about a bourgeois republic, and they saw the transition to a bourgeois republic as being the ideal place in which workers could organize. If you've got the right to vote, if you've got the right to organize political parties openly, if you've got the right to publish whatever you want, and so on, this is a much better position for workers than being constantly under the cosh of an autocratic feudal king or whatever else. But I think something changes fundamentally in 1871 with the Commune. And what Marx and Engels recognize is, and it's the only bit where they talk about how they would revise the Communist Manifesto on the basis of the experience of the Paris Commune of 1871, and the way in which Here we have a democracy which is direct, participative, where the representatives are not paid any more than the people they represent and are subject to recall at any time. And moreover, it's women have a crucial place at the heart of the commune and so on. So state capital is an interesting one because, as you know, there was blood and snot all over the carpet for years between people who saw the Soviet Union as a state capitalist or a workers' state of one sort or another. What I would argue, of course, is that that has to be understood as something which is historically specific and had to be understood in its own terms. I think there is an important distinction between the republic that you're talking about, which is closer to what Marx and Engels talked about as the dictatorship of the proletariat. A state, yes, but a state which is concerned with the transition to a higher form of socialist society, in which democracy would just become a normal feature of what we do. Very soon we'd all get used to the idea that no one's having to make these decisions. You're not having to have a ballot every third Wednesday in the month on the whole range of different things, because people would just organize stuff. And you start to see how the state withers away. We'll come on to it more when we talk about the distinction between Marx and the anarchists. Here we've mentioned Proudhon just to draw out the relationship that he had to Saint-Simon and the legacy of the Great French Revolution. But we'll go on to see how Bakunin in particular played a destructive role in the context of the First International. So freedom, democracy, and the republic, but the republic that ultimately withers away. If anybody thinks that it's far-fetched, if anybody thinks that, well, you know, if you look at the numbers of people who are in Marxist parties of one sort or other, is something to be sorry about. Well, if you think about the large numbers of people who were in Stalinist parties, were they ever part of the left? Or were they an impediment to the development of the possibility of socialism? As I say, when things happen, they happen very quickly. No one, when I joined the YCL, thought the Soviet Union would collapse. And I would suggest that we're seeing, for example, a situation where Israel is now completely transparent. The relationship between Israel and NATO and the United Kingdom is completely transparent and open to millions. And when things move, they move very quickly. I think the task is for our socialism to be as scientific as it is socialist. Marx didn't have the last word, and we still have to develop his ideas.
Very good last words. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you all for a really good, interesting discussion today. I really enjoyed that. Join us next week to the Communist Culture Club, if you can. Good night, comrades. Thank you, Ian.